be that the polarized style of training might not actually be the best style of training for your rider type. And if you're looking at raising your VO2 max, might you actually be better off spending more time doing tempo and threshold training? Some new research that I was digging into does suggest that for certain riders, tempo might actually be better at raising your top end. And that's what I'm going to dig into today. My name is Landry. I am a coach and the senior leader here at EVOQ Bike, and let's get right into it. So, this topic was kind of actually brought up by one of my athletes, and he noticed that we were doing a lot of tempo during base season, and he actually had a really good question of why are we doing tempo? You know, I always hear about polarized training being the best, and I hear you guys preaching it. So what is the purpose of tempo? And I guess I'm having a hard time seeing what the benefits of it actually is. And I did end up replying to him, telling him like, this is why we do tempo. This is why it is an effective way of training. But it actually did get me curious of like, let's look at what the science says about tempo. What is the benefit of tempo? And ended up finding a meta-analysis that came out at the end of 2024, so pretty recently, where they looked at 13 different studies that were comparing a more pyramidal style of training. So that's going to be focusing more on like tempo and threshold and a little bit less high intensity versus a completely polarized plan. And they actually found some really interesting things. And so I wanted to discuss those today and then also talk about why might this be the case? How is it that tempo could actually be more effective for improving your top end fitness and getting you prepared for races? And more importantly, is this the right style of training for you? So when they looked at these different studies, they really actually did not find any difference between pyramidal and polarized training in terms of overall performance benefit. They were particularly relating it to VO2 max. But what they did see when they delved into the data is if they split the groups into what would be more recreational riders or newer cyclists and elite athletes, they actually found that the newer riders, the riders with a lower VO2 max, the more recreational, quote unquote, cyclists, actually responded better to the pyramidal style of training than the polarized style of training. They actually increased their VO2 max more by having a less polarized training approach versus the elite athletes responded better to a completely polarized plan. So basically what that means is that a newer rider, a less fit rider with a potentially lower VO2 max actually might raise their VO2 max better with doing a more tempo threshold based style of training. And how could that be? How could it be that riding, middle of the road could actually improve your VO2 max better than a pyramid or a polarized VO2 max style of training? And I'm just going to say a disclaimer here. A lot of this is speculative, but these are just kind of the thoughts that I synthesized as to why this might be the case. And the first thing that I would surmise as to why this could be the case is actually fiber type conversion. So especially if you get a rider that does not have an endurance background or much of an athletic background at all, they are probably going to be a little bit more anaerobic. They're going to have a few more of those quote unquote like couch potato fibers that are a little bit less aerobically trained. And with those anaerobic fibers, they produce a lot of lactate, and basically that means they have a higher VLA max and thus a lower VO2 max. And one of the initial adaptations that we will see with newer recreational cyclists is those fiber type conversions transitioning from more anaerobic fiber types to aerobic fiber types. So your type 2X fast twitch fibers actually transition to type 2A more aerobically trained fibers. We have even seen some research that shows that type 2 fibers can convert to type 1 fibers. And so that is one of the primary adaptations that we see, especially with newer cyclists that are more anaerobically trained. And thus, with more of those fiber type conversions, you will improve your aerobic capacity and your VO2 max. And so something that we see with tempo is that long, constant tension on those more anaerobic fibers. And when we take those and we train those aerobically, we fatigue those fibers. We are transitioning those from anaerobic to aerobic by doing those longer style of intervals. And you can probably kind of feel this. If you go and ride at tempo for 2 hours, your legs start hurting and they get really tired. And kind of what that is you are cycling through all those muscle fibers, training them aerobically. And that's really what leads to those fiber type conversions. And so effectively, my speculation would suggest that a newer rider that is more anaerobically trained or doesn't have as much of those fiber type conversions will respond better to tempo because they're going to see a greater effect of those fiber type conversions with tempo intervals. And getting those fiber type conversions is what's going to lead to those VO2 max increases in the long run. So that would be, my first speculation as to why that would be the case versus a more seasoned rider, somebody who's been riding for a decade. They're probably already going to be super aerobically trained. And so to get those adaptations, they really have to be doing the harder, shorter efforts to raise the VO2 max. The second reason why I think this might be the case is actually going to be efficiency and technique. So as a newer rider, a more recreational cyclist, they're typically much less efficient than a more elite cyclist. That's actually one of the biggest things that separates an elite athlete from, more of an age group or recreational cyclist is efficiency. And so, when you're doing a tempo interval, it's not really that hard. And so you really have a chance to focus on that efficiency and that technique and your breathing and keeping your core engaged, versus if you're railing a VO2 max interval, a lot of times, you're not really thinking too much about that. You're just trying to hit the numbers. And so perhaps with a newer rider doing a lot of those sustained tempo efforts can really train you to pedal more efficiently. And, we could see this with low cadence torque intervals as well, and starting off with those more tempo style intervals can help make a newer rider more efficient so that they can get more out of those VO2 max intervals when they actually start doing them. Another theory that I have for why this could be the case is that tempo is actually going to be less taxing than a VO2 max workout. So obviously tempo is going to be more intense than like zone 2, but tempo overall is going to be much less taxing on your body than doing a really hard VO2 max workout. And it could be that, for a newer rider who's less experienced with training, that perhaps doing a lot of VO2 max might actually be a little bit too much. It might be a little bit too demanding for a rider that just doesn't have the tolerance to that. And I know that, when I start coaching a newer athlete, someone who's like basically brand new to cycling, a lot of times they are not actually prepared to handle those really hard VO2 max workouts. Maybe they can do one or two of those efforts, but by the time they get to the third one, they can't handle it. And so, you kind of have to really build your tolerance to those higher intensity efforts. And so it could just be that if we look at the cost versus benefit for a newer rider, maybe the cost is too high and doesn't provide as much benefit versus, with the tempo, we can get a lot of those benefits that I already talked about without as much of the cost. And it's going to be less likely to push you to overtraining. And then the other thing is just kind of like working it up, getting used to going hard. So, the longer you cycle, the longer you get into your training, the more mentally adapted you get to going hard. And in a weird way, you kind of grow numb to the pain, or rather you learn to live with the pain. You get used to what it feels like to go hard. And, with a newer cyclist, they might not really be used to that. What is it like to really push those limits? And so, starting off, if you're a newer cyclist, starting off with a really hard VO2 max session might be too difficult. And to just get mentally adapted to what it's like to go hard, maybe a tempo or threshold is actually going to be better. And you're going to execute it more cleanly and, work up to those VO2 max efforts. So, those are just some highly speculative theories as to why I think this could be the case. How could tempo be more effective at raising VO2 max in a newer cyclist? And I think that if we compare this to a elite athlete, on the flip side, why would an elite athlete respond better to a more polarized approach? Why would they respond better to a lot more higher intensity VO2 max efforts? Well, that kind of goes back to some of what I said about, the cost versus benefit for maybe a more experienced elite athlete. Tempo is not hard enough. You could just do tempo all day and it's not even going to wear you out that much. To really raise that ceiling, you got to be going max. You got to be going really hard. And then the other thing is, as a more elite level cyclist or just a more experienced cyclist, you're probably going to have a lot of those fiber type conversions already in place. You're already going to have a massively trained aerobic engine. So it's really a matter of taking that aerobic engine as far as you can. So it's less about getting those fiber type conversions, but more about taking those fiber type conversions that you already have and driving the system as hard as possible, if that makes sense. So just some speculation there. So then the big picture question is, should you be doing more tempo? Maybe you are a newer cyclist and you've just been hearing, polarized, avoid tempo. And maybe it's like, oh, maybe I should actually switch it up and do tempo. So, are you a type of rider that could potentially respond to incorporating more tempo and more threshold into your training? And I would just say that every rider should pretty much spend time in almost every single zone in some capacity. I don't believe that people should only do tempo and sweet spot. I also don't think that people should only be doing high intensity intervals. There's a place for everything. It's just a matter of how much of those things are you going to do and when are you going to do them. So, if you are a newer rider, somebody who is just trying to build, their tolerance to the high intensity efforts and build that durability, and maybe you've tried some harder VO2 max sessions and they feel too hard, you're not able to actually hit the numbers and execute them, you might actually need to focus more on those lower intensity zones to just build that durability and that tolerance before progressing to the higher intensity efforts. So if you're a newer rider, I think that you could benefit from this more pyramidal style of training. And I think the second type of rider that could really benefit from maybe spending some more time in these tempo threshold style zones would be a more anaerobic rider who is trying to become more aerobic. So if you are naturally a really gifted sprinter or more punchy type rider, or perhaps, maybe you've been doing track racing or even like BMX, but you want to transition to doing gravel or something like that, you're probably naturally going to be a little bit more anaerobic. And so you might actually really benefit from spending more time at tempo and threshold to get some of those aerobic adaptations that we're talking about that could lead to those top end gains down the road as well. And then like third of all, if it's just a personal weakness for you and it's in line with your goals. So, maybe you've actually got a great FTP, maybe you've got a great VO2 max and you've been riding for a while and you know that you really can't move the needle much more on that than what you already have, but you find that the muscular endurance is a little bit of a weakness. You might actually benefit from spending, more time doing these extended tempo intervals, particularly if you're training for like, some longer Grand Fondo sportive type thing or gravel. You could really benefit from that. But this does not mean foregoing zone 2. So a lot of times people hear, oh, tempo, sweet spot, base. Okay, that's all I'm going to do every single day. No zone 2. No, pretty much what we're talking about here is you are going to be replacing what would be ordinarily high intensity sessions with maybe more tempo and threshold. So instead of VO2 max, maybe you're going to do sweet spot or threshold, and you're still going to be doing the zone 2. everybody needs to be doing zone 2. So don't make the mistake of just doing only tempo or threshold. And yeah, that's pretty much all I wanted to talk about. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on this. Are you a rider that feels like they have naturally responded better to, a more pyramidal style of training? Maybe Polarized doesn't work as well for you, and maybe this gives you some context onto why that could be. Or do you disagree with this? Do you think that Polarized is the only way, no tempo at all? I'm really curious to hear your thoughts, so let me know in the comments section down below. And if you have any thoughts or questions on this, I would love to hear from you. You can email me at landry@evoq.bike, and I will see you guys in the next video.